Okay, fine. I'll do the thing. But this is going to make you angry. Don't say I didn't warn you. What's up, everybody? Jeff here, and a couple weeks ago I did a video about the most horrible, worst people in all of Malifaux, and people seemed very into that. There were a lot of interesting comments about people that you all thought were the worst characters in Malifaux, and some of the ones that you thought that shouldn't have been so high on my list. So I thought we would go through and take a more positive approach to this and talk about some of the best characters in Malifaux. Now, this is actually a slightly harder problem, partially because most people in Malifaux are horrible and terrible, but also partially because it's hard to define what makes a good person. A lot of the characters that might come to mind when you think about good people, especially in Malifaux, might just be characters that you don't know have done horrible stuff, right? So the lack of bad acts makes them good. On the other hand, there are people in Malifaux who have done really positive things, really good things, and many of those people have also done some bad things. So how do you weight all of these different factors to determine who is the best? Should we just take somebody that we don't know that much about, who hasn't done horrible murder or other kinds of terrible things, and say, well, they must be really good? Or do we take somebody who's done some fantastic things, but also has a dark side? Well, I think the holistic approach is probably going to be the best one, so let's get right into my top 5 most good characters in Malifaux. Number 5, and we're going to start off controversial right off the bat, we have Molly Squidpidge. Now, I suspect that your opinion on Molly is going to really heavily depend on how you feel about vigilantism. Just a little bit of background about Molly. Molly was a reporter who worked for a newspaper, and she was really all about her career until Seamus killed her and then revived her, and then she died and then got revived again. It's a little messy and complicated. Now, has she done some bad things while she was under the semi-control of Seamus? Probably, almost certainly. But she didn't really have full control of herself until a little bit later on in the story. And since then, she's really been all about leading her little band of sort of rejected creatures. Now, that's kind of cute in and of itself, because all of the things in her crew are kind of rejects and outsiders who follow her as their leader. But I think the most interesting thing about Molly is some of the things that she has done along with Karai. They went on a tear through the slums at one point, going after people who were criminals, abusers, and in particularly sex traffickers. They would pretty much just kill any of these people that they found because they could. And this all culminated in the events that went down at the Grey Lord, where they went on a rampage and killed this sort of high-level human trafficker slash pimp. Now, you might hear that and say, wow, she's horrible because she just goes out and murders people without any kind of due process. But on the other hand, these are horrible, horrible people who were not going to be brought to justice any other way because, well, they live in Malifaux, and members of the guild are some of their patrons anyway. It's sort of like a Batman situation, except that Batman is a rich playboy who goes out and does his vigilante work, and Molly is just a nice lady who likes to knit sweaters for her friends. Now, maybe I'm a little biased because I think Molly is awesome, but let me know what you think. I suspect that half of you are going to be very angry that I put Toni Ironsides on this list, and the other half of you are going to be very angry that she's not higher on this list. So let's start with the bad. Toni Ironsides used to be an enforcer for the Arcanists, and according to some people, the Arcanists are a terrorist organization. I would argue that they're much closer to the freedom fighter side of things, and as the enforcer, she was in charge of going out and sort of keeping people in line and making sure that people weren't going rogue. And at least from the one example that we have of her doing this, it seems like the person that she was going after was definitely a bad person. So breaking some knees for an organization that you may or may not agree with is probably not something that you would characterize as the most positive thing, but it's not really the most evil either. Now, more recently and more famously, Toni Ironsides made a deal with the guild where she gave them Dr. Ramos, who they had been after for a very long time, but were never actually able to get. And in exchange, the guild put pressure on the United States to emancipate all people. Notably, at this time, slavery was still a thing in the United States, and Toni Ironsides knew that all too well, because one of her parents were actually killed by a lynch mob in the U.S. Now, it's debatable whether turning on Ramos was a positive thing or a negative thing. I guess from a moral standpoint, it's probably not great, because the guild is a horrible, corrupt organization. But on the other hand, you can make the argument that Ramos had it coming to him. He had really been neglecting his duties as the organizer and sort of leader of the MNSU as well as the Arcanists. And he was off on his own quest for more power. So when Toni turned him in, not only was that maybe not the worst thing to do, but also the upside was that all the slaves were freed. So there's obviously a lot of gray area here where she's doing some things that are maybe not necessarily the best. But in terms of the positive impact that she's had on the world, I think emancipating all the slaves is probably the most positive thing that any character in Malifaux has ever done, arguably. So I think that has to earn her a spot on this list. Now, from a little more subtle perspective, she is also the leader of the more positive side of the Arcanists, which is the union, where they are fighting for workers' rights. And it seems like she is very popular among the workers in doing that. If you know anything about the Arcanists and the MNSU, then you know that they started as sort of a traditional labor union where they were looking out for the well-being of miners and other kinds of laborers. And while Ironsides famously kind of hates dealing with the bureaucracy and the paperwork, it seems like she does a pretty good job of leading that organization. For me, even if you held all the rest of it aside, I think being the representative of the people on the more peaceful side of things, fighting against the guild, would put her on this list in and of itself. But please get down in the comments and tell me why I'm wrong. If you're enjoying this video and you want to support the channel, then there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. The first would be to pick up some merchandise through my merch store. You can grab a t-shirt, a hoodie, a mug, a sticker, all sorts of cool stuff like that. You can also shop using my affiliate links, so if you're going to make any purchases from any of these companies, you can use the links in the description below to make your purchases, and it will go directly to supporting the channel at no extra cost to you. There's also a link for my Ko-fi if you would just like to give me a tip, or my Patreon if you want to support me longer term. I have a bunch of different tiers there, and there are all sorts of benefits available to people, such as early access to videos, ad-free videos, the opportunity to vote in polls about upcoming content, and extra entries into the giveaways that I run occasionally. But if none of that is your cup of tea, no problem at all. Just make sure that you're subscribed to the channel and leave a like on the video. It actually helps a tremendous amount. And if you want to go the extra mile, then consider sharing the video out with some friends who you think might find it interesting. The YouTube algorithm is not kind to small YouTubers, so that helps a whole bunch. Other than that, consider joining the Discord, also linked in the description, where you can come and hang out with me and the rest of the community and talk games. But with that, let's get right back to the video. Now, Maxine is someone who I hadn't originally had in mind for a list like this, but honestly, the more I thought about it, the more I thought that she has to be in this conversation. When we were originally introduced to Maxine, she was just a scientist and an explorer. She was out cruising around the world on her boat, going on adventures. And while sometimes those types of things can have really negative elements to them, where you're exploiting people or stealing precious artifacts, we never really get the sense that Maxine is involved in anything like that. She has a lot of people from all around the world as part of her crew, and we don't really know a ton about exactly what it is that they're doing, but we know they're doing science, and we don't really get any indication that she's doing anything terrible along the way. She's also got a golden retriever husband who cares a lot about her, and I think as the only representative of like a healthy married couple in the game, I think it makes sense to assume that she's a pretty good person. Now, obviously, that all gets a little bit more complicated once the Burning Man got involved with things, and she was definitely corrupted by the Burning Man to an extent, but she wasn't out there doing murder in the streets like some people who joined the cult of the Burning Man. And in fact, she spent most of her time during the Burning Man's presence in Malifaux doing research to learn how to defeat the Burning Man. She was instrumental in the whole process, and even though she's working with an organization that I would argue is pretty evil, she was probably the most important person in that organization as far as bringing down the Burning Man. She did most of the research to understand where the Burning Man was going to appear, and then helped in the entire process right up until the point where they had their big showdown. If you were to look at her title version's model, you might assume that she was getting up to some bad stuff. And maybe that's true, but we never see any of that stuff in any of the stories. So I think not only does she seem like she's just a pretty nice person to begin with, but she also did some pretty significant positive things for the world in helping to bring down the Burning Man. Now, Reva may not have as much of an impact on the state of the world as some of the other characters that we're talking about here. But when it comes to people who are just kind-hearted, I think she's definitely got to be on this list. Reva has some sort of strange connection with the dead, and as a child, her parents sort of locked her in her bedroom because they didn't really understand what was going on with her, and they called an exorcist. Now, that has echoes of religious trauma that some people experience in the real world, but Reva actually manages to convince this exorcist to spring her from her prison, and they go off and have their own adventures together. Now, part of that is because Reva seems to have this ability to influence people, which is something that we see in some of the necromancers and resurrectionists in Malifaux from time to time. You could argue that influencing people in this sort of magical way is kind of bad because you're taking away their free will. But on the other hand, Reva really seems to use this for good for the most part. She started her little cult, and really her entire focus was about comforting both sick people as well as the dying and the dead. The undead obviously have a bad rap in Malifaux because they're typically controlled by necromancers who want to do bad things. But she found that there are quite a few undead out there who are just sort of rogue, wandering zombies who are not under the influence of a necromancer, and they are not necessarily malicious in that state. While most people would be inclined to kill them anyway, Reva tries to protect those individuals because she feels that they deserve an opportunity to live, quote unquote. We see a few examples of her comforting people and bringing peace to them while they're on their deathbeds. And again, it's not exactly clear how she's doing that. It seems like maybe she's exerting some influence over their mind in some way, which, again, sounds kind of evil, but if the outcome is that people pass on a little bit more peacefully, then I think that's probably not a bad thing. Interestingly, Reva is also someone who came under the influence of the Burning Man, and we don't really know what she got up to during that time. We know she was still taking care of her little cult of followers that she had, but we don't know if she got involved in any Cult of the Burning Man murdery type stuff. Now, we do know that Reva is not above using violence to protect the followers that she has, because we see this big scene where she has a standoff with Anya as well as Lady Justice. And there's definitely an implied threat in that standoff that she will attack them, but she does choose not to. Even though violence has been done against her and her people, when given the opportunity and a promise from Lady Justice that they will stop doing this, Reva seems happy to just kind of walk away. There are very few people in the Malifaux setting that I think you can describe as pacifists, and I think Reva might be pretty close to that. On top of that, she seems very concerned with the well-being and the sort of comfort of the less fortunate around her, so I think that has to put her pretty high on this list. Cornelius Basse. Now, if you told me that I was going to put a cop as the number one spot on this list, I probably would have laughed at you until I thought about it a little bit more. Technically, Basse isn't a cop anymore, and part of that is because he had a run-in with the justice system back on Earth, and he found out how corrupt and twisted it was. So he sacrificed everything. He sort of left his position as a law enforcement officer and brought his daughter over to Malifaux to protect her. Unfortunately, the guild is in Malifaux, and they blackmailed him, essentially, into working for them. But what we know about the work that he was doing while he was working for the guild, it seems like it was a pretty positive thing. He was out trying to protect people from the cannibals up in the north, and sort of checking in on other contract towns around Malifaux. What we found out more recently is that when he was presented with a situation where the guild was doing guild stuff, which is to say abusing people and asking him to fire on protesters, Basse was having none of it and decided to abandon his position within the guild. It's tough to argue that anyone who has ever worked for the guild is a really good person, but it seems clear that Basse understands that, because as soon as things went a little bit too far, Basse decided that he was not working for the guild anymore, in spite of the fact that there was a huge risk to him and his daughter, who seems to be his number one priority. So he's a protective father who seems to have a good relationship with his daughter, and he sees the evils of the guild as well as the justice system back in the United States, and he stands against those things, at great risk to his own safety and freedom. Basse is a character that I want to see a lot more of in the lore, because I think there's a lot more that we can learn about him. I think there's a lot more stories that could be told featuring him and his relationship with the various people around him. And I'm really excited to see that he's joining up with the Arcanists, because I'm hoping that we're going to get a lot of stories that deal with him switching over from guild and explorers to Arcanists. He went from being a cop to working for the evil guild to now rejecting all of that and joining up with the good guys. So that's always good to see. And I think I'm pretty confident in saying he's got to be the most good character in all of Malifaux. He's protective, he's a good dad, he's got a moral compass, and those are things that we can't say about the vast majority of characters in this universe. Now, I know I told you I was going to give you a top 5, but there's one character left who I think really needs a shout out in a conversation like this. And while I'm not going to list them in a ranked order or call them an honorable mention, because honestly, they might be the best character, period, I do want to at least give a quick shout out to Nameless. Nameless is a tyrant from back in the day, and basically the story goes that the tyrants were out doing their tyranty things, which is to say, killing people, causing all sorts of mayhem and destruction, and Nameless rose up and helped the people of Malifaux to trap, destroy, disempower, or otherwise deal with all of the tyrants. Once that whole process was over, the people decided that Nameless had too much power herself, and they turned against Nameless and treated her like a tyrant as well. But I maintain that Nameless did nothing wrong. She is basically single-handedly responsible for defeating the tyrants back in the day, and if it wasn't for her, there's a good chance that all of Malifaux would have been destroyed hundreds of years before we ever actually saw any of the characters we know now. We don't know much about Nameless aside from that, really at all, but just in terms of the impact that her actions have had on the world, I think Nameless probably has to be all the way at the top of this list. Maybe we'll call it the top 5 good characters in Malifaux brought to you by Nameless. But anyway, get down in the comments below and let me know what you think of this list. Who do you think needs to be brought down a peg? Who do you think needs to be added to the list that I didn't talk about here? And of course, more importantly, give me reasons why. This is always a really interesting conversation to have, and this is one where I won't be surprised if other people's lists are entirely different from mine. I think this side of the argument is a lot more subjective in terms of what you think makes a good person, whereas pretty much everybody agrees that, like, Sonya Crid and Seamus are terrible. As always, I want to send a huge thank you to the extremely cool kids tier on Patreon, the Steam Parrot Scoundrels, Dogmatize, Spanner Rider, Dynat, Rob Younce, Tom Likely, and Russets. And thanks for watching.